Do, do, do. Do, do, do. Right.
We're just getting started.
It's like the first day of winter, you're like, oh, this is nice. The fourth day of winter, you're like, this is too much. Okay, we are continuing our study in the book of Job, but we are kind of doing a little bit of a side note last week and this week. Well, not last week, but last class. So if you can recall, last class we were talking about grief, because that's a very prominent subject in the book of Job, because Job is going through the grieving process while all of this is taking place. The Job, he's an innocent guy and he's going through terrible, terrible times. And we looked at how the grieving process works, and today we're going to talk a little bit more about how to address the people who are going through grief, which is a very important topic in Job because Job's friends really don't do a good job of it, right? And then I think next week we're going to start getting into what the things that Job says and things that Job's friends say, right? But grief these are very important topics, right? When we open up the book of Job, you see reason for him to grieve, right? You see his grief in these verses. 120, it says, "Then Job arose and tore his robe and shaved his head and fell on the ground and worshipped." So you see his grieving there mixed with, his godliness. You have chapter 2, verse 7 and 8. "So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and struck Job with loathsome sores from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. And he took a piece of broken pottery with which to scrape himself while he sat in the ashes." Right? We see Job's grief there. Not only is he trying to itch his terrible sores all over his bodies, but I think one of the things that show in that verse, the grieving process, is that he's in the ashes, right? The ashes were kind of the local city dump in a way where only the outcasts were, right? So he's lonely, he's depressed, he's been reduced to a terrible state. The grief itself, it's universal. It's felt by every person in the course of a lifetime. But at the same time, they're still very difficult and almost sort of mysterious things, right? Grief, if you define it, it's a normal process to the loss of any significant person, object, or opportunity. It is an experience of deprivation and anxiety that can show itself in one's behavior, emotions, thinking, physiology, interpersonal relationships, and spirituality, right? In last class, what we talked about, I think my major point were these 2 points. Christ has changed the meaning of grieving in that we have an afterlife, in that we have learned that there is a heaven where we can reunite with those who have passed, right? And second, Christ really demonstrated the importance of grieving. Even though we have an afterlife, even though we have the concept of the resurrection and heaven, Christ himself still grieved. Before he resurrected Lazarus, he grieved with Mary and Martha, right? Before he was crucified, he grieved for that significant event. Solomon himself said there is a time to weep, a time to laugh, a time to mourn, and a time to dance, right? The reality of heaven does not eliminate the pain of grief. It makes it easier. But even for Christians who believe in an afterlife, grief is normal, it's healthy, and it's intensely felt. So, as we come to the topic of helping people who go through grief, right, that's a really big topic because Job's friends just simply, they do a great job and then they do a terrible job, honestly. I was reading about the United States Surgeon General C. Everett Koop. He gained a lot of recognition during the AIDS pandemic, right? Before then, Dr. Koop was known as a highly regarded pediatric surgeon. He worked a lot with dying children and grieving parents. And one day, this famous doctor learned that his own son had died as he was climbing the mountains of New Hampshire. In a moving and an inspirational portrayal of their grief, this doctor and his wife wrote about their sadness and their faith throughout this period. He said, "Our family life will never be the same, but we are trusting in the Lord to help us accept the empty place in our family circle and to keep us constantly aware that David, their son, is in heaven, which is far better for him." So like the hundreds of parents whom he himself had counseled, him and his wife found this permanent void in their life after their son's death. He said, in an effort to be comforting, so many Christians glibly say, God will fill the void. He said, instead, we found that the void is never really filled, but God makes the void bearable. And in their grieving, this family discovered what I think a lot of people who assist others fail to realize, right? The grieving are really not looking for these pat responses from people. Instead, grieving people need understanding, they need reassurance, they need contact with sensitive individuals who care enough to listen. Helping the grieving is less about having the right words and more about offering presence, patience, compassion, and Christ-like love, right? Helping the grieving is not solving their problems. Their problems are bigger than what you can solve. There is no one-time fix for grieving. There just simply isn't. And to try to solve it like that is insulting. And so our responsibility, we have a Christian responsibility to help the grieving, do we not? There are so many passages about Christians helping the grieving, just a handful of them. Romans says, "Rejoice with those who rejoice, weep with those who weep." Right? When you are unaffected by a brother in Christ who is mourning, that is unchristlike, right? There comes a time to bury one another's burden, like Galatians 6:2 says, right? Grief is no doubt a major burden, right? 1 Thessalonians 4, Paul is writing about reuniting with the Christians who have passed away in the resurrection, right? And he gives kind of an overview of how that's going to happen, how Christ is going to return, the dead are going to raise, and then we're all going to reunite with each other and with the Lord. And at the end of all that, he said, "Therefore, encourage one another with these words." We have a responsibility to encourage each other with the idea of the resurrection in heaven. Christians have a responsibility to encourage one another. 2 Corinthians 1, "Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our affliction, so that we may be able to comfort those who are in any affliction with the comfort with which we ourselves are comforted by God." So God is the God of comfort. He gives us comfort so that we can comfort others, right? That's our responsibility. And you have James, "Religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their affliction and to keep oneself unstained from the world." The visiting of orphans and widows. The fact that he said in their affliction gives the idea that they are grieving, gives the idea that, it gives the sense, at least to me, and I think this is kind of what James is trying to imply, the reason why they just became orphans or widows, right? How do people become widows or orphans? Most commonly through death, right? With widows, you definitely become a widow through death. Orphans, usually, I think what he's talking about is the parents passing. And so in their affliction, I think he's talking about in their grieving, right? So visiting them in the midst of their grieving, right? If that's not exactly what he's talking about, it's certainly included in it. So we have plenty of verses on the command for Christians to assist people who are going through these tough times, right? So, considering these passages, you think about Job's friends, they really failed to live up to these ideals, didn't they? Right? They were to bear Job's burden, and I think instead they just added to his burden. They were supposed to weep with him, and instead they blamed him. They were to encourage him, and they discouraged him. They were to give him comfort, and they added to his distress. They visited him in his affliction and added to that affliction. Did they not? And so when we consider our own task in helping those who have just recently lost people, or, grieving is not just about losing someone. Sometimes it's losing something or an opportunity. Most commonly, it's someone. But as we're trying to help people who are going through these difficult tasks, what are some ways that we can help people? What are some ways that we can help people who are going through the grieving process? Yeah, Clint?
Sometimes it's just being there with them and listening to them. It doesn't mean you need to talk a lot, explain things or anything. It's just being with them so they feel something to say.
Just being with them and listening to them. That's big. Shirley?
That's kind of where I was headed. I think very often we're afraid to go because we don't know what to say.
Mm-hmm.
Really, for the most part, you don't have to do much more than show up.
Yep.
They will talk,
Mm-hmm.
and you listen.
That's a great point.
Don't try to fix them because it's not fixable. That person's gone.
Mhm.
Everything's different forever.
That's absolutely
The
right.
same. But it helps for them. And then later, have them over for a meal. Take them out to eat. Go visit them.
Mhm.
Don't forget them.
Right.
Because their grieving goes on. We just move on with our lives.
Yeah. Yeah. Great points.
But
Yeah.
they do not.
You can't fix it, like you said, just being there and assisting them, serving them a meal, taking them out to eat. I like what you said. We're afraid to do it because we don't know what to say. And that, again, the reason that we're afraid, the reason that we are afraid because we don't know what to say is because we have in our mind the idea that if I could say the right thing, it would make them feel completely better. And that's not how we should think. There is no, they're going to feel completely better in an instance by something you say. It's a slow process, and rather than saying something, like you said, Shirley, we really have to hold their hand through it, right? What are some things that we can do to help grieving people? Any other thoughts?
Well, I know when my husband passed away, Brenda was there every step of the way. She helped. I had 2 kids, they were 11, 13 at the time.
Mhm.
She helped take some of that while I was sitting there. I was 37.
Mm-hmm.
Expect to lose past that young.
Oh, that's a great point.
And it helped with little things, the laundry, the cleaning, the cooking, bringing a meal.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just, and less is more on the whole, never say, I know what you're going through.
Mm-hmm.
No, that's.
Don't say I know what you're going through.
Well, I heard that so many times, and then my sister took care of that.
Well, that's great. Yeah, your sister helped you. Especially if you're grieving while you have children, right? Yeah, that's especially difficult. So helping with those small things like laundry, the children, everything, that's big.
But it was back worse, because he had a heart attack the day his mom died of breast cancer. So my kids we lost my mother-in-law, my husband.
Yeah, that's, a lot of grief in a small period makes it worse. Yeah.
And she handled the whole probate court. And sometimes it's like Shirley said, taking them somewhere.
Mm-hmm. Just giving a ride. Yeah. Aaron?
I was actually kind of going to say the same thing, like when people, I guess this is more of something not to do, but just go and offer help.
Offer help.
Say like, I'm coming over to do laundry for you, or
Mhm.
do your dishes, or to cook you a meal, instead of asking, what do you need from me? Because that adds another level of burden on them of thinking through like, okay, well, what do I need? Like, and sometimes that, is appropriate, but if you are already there offering help in some way, that can also kind of open up that conversation of
Yeah.
what else do you need at that point, once you get some of those smaller pieces out of the way, like laundry or something.
Yeah, that's a great point. Sometimes when you leave it vague and say, "What can I do for you?" In the middle of the grieving process, one thing that you don't want them, when you say, "What do you need?" that adds another responsibility for them to figure out, okay, what do I need? And when you're in the middle of the grieving process and it's still fresh, that just itself is an additional burden, kind of. So, yeah, absolutely. You want to be a little bit more specific. You want to show up and say, I'm going to do this for you, in a gentle way, of course. But saying, what do you need, or saying, let me know if you need help, often doesn't really go that far, right? Because they're in the middle of trying to figure out, what do I need, right? That's a huge battle for someone who's in the middle of shock. Yeah, Kathy?
I was just putting on a couple of days. Judy, I've given her about 2 days. She is a mess. She wants to go home.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
I said she wants to go home.
Oh, wants to go home.
Yeah, she's just out of her head.
Yeah.
It's time for her to go.
Right, right. And that's a very difficult conversation to have, and that's a very difficult, in those kind of situations, it's hard to figure out what's the right thing to say and what's the right thing to do. Yeah, it's very hard. Yeah. So, the things that I, brought up, ways that we can help those in grief. Here, this one is before the grief actually occurs, when you're able to predict the grief. Now, there are plenty of times when you are not able to predict the grief. There are times when people pass quickly and unexpectedly, and I think, I don't think it's controversial to say that when it's unexpected, it makes the grief harder because they're not as prepared. But as people tend to get older, they start to consider their mortality more. And that consideration of mortality can help you go through the grieving process ever so lightly before it actually occurs with others. Like there have been spouses, there have been people whose spouses are, they've been on the edge of passing for a while now, for several years, and they've been taking care of them. And through that process, they're able to go through the grieving process a little bit before it even occurs, and it makes the grieving process a little easier. Now, that doesn't always happen, but sometimes when you are talking about the loss before it even occurs, it can prepare you. And so if you're able to see it coming, conversations like these can help you and make the grieving process a little easier. Now, you don't want to be that person who's just like, well, have you considered that they're about to die? Of course you don't want to be that kind of person. But, having these kind of conversations in a very gentle and at appropriate time can help you, right, Shirley?
Well, you're almost just describing what happened. Karen was sick for a long time, last 3 years. It was pretty tough, in and out of the hospital a lot. And then the last few months was really, really bad. The last 7 weeks was hospice, but it was in the house. So I was taking 100% care of the nurse coming.
Right.
Check on him. And in your brain, you're preparing.
Yeah, yep.
And you think, okay, I got this.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and we had gone through all the papers, they were together when he was we knew it was happening, but he still was able to do that for me. That was all in place. So this is the place, this compartment.
Mm-hmm.
But when he took his last breath, it wasn't my brain,
Yep.
it was my heart.
Mm-hmm.
And so your heart's never prepared.
I agree.
But your brain can be.
Yeah.
It did help.
Yeah, I'm sure it does help.
And one way I was ready because he was ready
Mhm.
and he was suffering. So it was a blessing, but it still was a loss.
I agree.
It was long.
Yep. Yeah.
So the heart just doesn't, it doesn't have those compartments.
Right. You're right.
Yeah.
Yeah. It makes the grieving process easier, but I'm never going to say it's easy. Right. I mean, because when when you see someone is in active pain and then they pass, there is that little consolation of saying they're not hurting anymore, right? But if they were never hurting to begin with and they pass unexpectedly, you don't get that little cushion of thought, right? So absolutely, I mean, it can help. And of course, this is before it even happens, right? But when it does happen, I think, and we've mentioned it quite a bit, the most important thing is just to be present and available. I really have to say, if the book of Job ended before chapter 3, at the end of chapter 2, Job's friends would have earned a 100% score on being good friends. 100%. They did absolutely the right thing. Let's read a couple of these verses. So it says, this is at the end of chapter 2, after he starts grieving, Job's friends come to him. It says, now when Job's 3 friends heard all of this evil that had come upon him, they came each from his own place, Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, Zophar the Naamathite. They made an appointment together to come show him sympathy and comfort him. That is absolutely crucial, that last sentence. They decided that they were going to get with him to comfort him, to show sympathy and comfort him. That they're being good friends here. They said, Job's going through it. Hey, how about all 3 of us go visit him? I think that's great, 100%. They decided to go visit, and then this is what happened. When they saw him from a distance, they did not recognize him, and they raised their voices and wept. They tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads towards heaven. Again, 10 out of 10. They are doing absolutely incredible. They saw his pain, and it became their pain. They had compassion, right? They wept with him. They were hurt in their heart because he was hurt in his heart, right? It says, verse 13, and they sat with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his suffering was very great. 10 out of 10. They are doing incredible here. They didn't address it because they wanted to let Job be the first person to say something, right? They saw his pain and they saw, this is not the time for words. This is not the time for discussion. This is not the time for, the debate the thoughts that might be mulling around in their head. They stayed quiet and they didn't say a thing. And they're doing so amazing here. I mean, had the book of Job ended here, this would be a great lesson on how to counsel friends who are going through this, right? C.S. Lewis, he wrote this after his wife died. He says, there's this sort of invisible blanket between the world and me. They feel this, people who are going through the grieving feel this separation from people. The idea that you feel like every time someone looks at you, they can just tell what you're going through. And being there helps slowly break that barrier down, right? When you know someone who's going through grief, this is what you need to do. Right? We see the same thing with Jesus, right? Jesus went to be with Martha and Mary over Lazarus, right? And also, Job's friends were with him for 7 days. And that's really big. People who are grieving really don't need to be left alone for a while. They're so sensitive and they don't know how to take care of themselves. They become, when you're in that deep state of shock, they become childlike and just don't know what to do. They're paralyzed, right? And they're not thinking rationally. And so they need someone to be with them. But even beyond, the first week, grief is a journey. And so one of the best things you could do is just be there for them. Check in on them weeks, months later. Remember, around the anniversaries and the birthdays of the people that they lost. Even years after the process, they're still going through it. And the second thing, that's the most important thing, is just be present and available. The second thing, and we've mentioned this one already, is listen, say little. One of the most important things here is to just listen. And one thing to know is that when people are going through grief, they're going to say things that are very difficult to hear. but you have to let them say it. In the grieving process, the mind goes to a very dark place, or at least it can. And in that dark place, they're going to express anger, doubt, confusion. They're going to question God, like Job does. Job questions God. And they might even accuse God of doing something wrong, like Job does. He said terrible things. But in that moment, it is not the time to address it, right? They need to get it out of their system. James 1:19, know this, my beloved brothers, let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger. Proverbs 21:23, whoever keeps his mouth and his tongue keeps himself out of trouble. So we have to be a careful listener. People are going to ask things like, why did God do this? Why is he doing it now? They're going to have guilt, they're going to have confusion, they're going to have despair. And the thing is, our religious cliches are not going to be able to help in that moment, right? Even if what we're saying is true, that doesn't mean it's the right thing to say at that moment. Don't push. Just listen. Rob?
We also need to remember that everybody's grieving is different.
Mm-hmm.
You may have longer periods of other things, so you need to be prepared for when it may happen. For me, I was in denial for like 3 years, and you would never know that I've lost anybody.
Mm-hmm.
And then it may come out in a way that people don't understand because it's been so long, they don't know why you're doing it. So we've got to also take it that the people that have lost may not react like a normal person that has lost.
Absolutely.
It all depends on how they raise, what their feelings are, how they deal with stuff. So it's not a quick process. It's a process that can take years.
Mm-hmm. That's a great point. That's a great point. People grieve in very unique ways, and you're absolutely right. People can be in denial for long periods of time, and they may act completely normal. I knew one person who told me that their mother, whenever their dad passed, or their grandfather, or I think even a sibling, the mother, what she did is she would go throughout all the house, take the photos of the individuals, and stick them in the attic, and they just kind of moved on with life, never addressing it, right? And that's not healthy, but in those situations, it's like, what do you do, right? When you're dealing with, and I'll get to this in a second, when you're dealing with unhealthy grief, and grief that is what they call complicated, you need to take a step back from that, and we need a professional in that moment. But it's important to just note that every person is different, and if they're acting strange, just know that's par for the course, right? Yeah, Aaron?
A few weeks ago, when we had like the first part of Christmas, my sister was here, and we have, obviously we're sisters, so we lost all of our grandparents. We were raised in the same house, by the same parents. She and I grieve so differently. She's very open,
Mm-hmm.
very much like crying, like, I am not, which may seem weird given my line of work, but I'm like very much an internal griever.
Mm-hmm.
And I do not like to show that outward emotion until I'm like kind of removed from it. It doesn't mean I'm not feeling it. It
Right.
very much am. But it's very much like internal for me
Mhm.
until I'm away from the situation.
Yeah.
Sometimes it will like come out, especially maybe like at a service for the person, but it's just so different how the two of us, who in a lot of ways are fairly similar, are just very different.
Yeah, that is interesting. Yeah, how you express grief in such very opposite ways. Like when Brett passed, Brett and I were getting very close, and Laurel, I think just at the end of the day, Laurel said, "Why aren't you crying?" And I said, I'm just not." And she said, "Aren't you sad?" I was like, "Oh, I'm very sad. I'm just not crying." It's just, grieving is just different for different people. It absolutely is. And in Job chapter 3 is a very strong example of how people react to grieving, because it's interesting, because in Job chapter 1 and 2, he's still in shock, right? Whenever he falls down, he tears his robe, he shaves his head, and he gets on the ground and worships, right? That's kind of his initial reaction, but the shock kind of sets in, and then he sits down and he doesn't say anything for 7 days, right? And then chapter 3, he opens his mouth. And what he says is very hard to listen to. He says very difficult things. If you were his friend, it would be hard to hear these things. So let's read some from chapter 3. I want you to understand that people who are grieving, they're going to say hard things, and you got to figure out, is this the right time to address it or not, right? It says, "Then Job opened his mouth and cursed the day he was born. He said, 'I wish the day I was born would be lost forever. I wish the night they said, "It's a boy," had never happened. I wish that day had remained dark. I wish God above had forgotten that day and not let any light shine on it. Why didn't I die when I was born? Why didn't I die as I came from my mother's womb? Why did my mother hold me on her knees? Why didn't her breasts feed me? If I had died when I was born, I'd be at peace now. I wish I were asleep and at rest with the kings and their advisors who built palaces that are now in ruins. Why must a suffering person continue to live? Why let anyone live such a bitter life? Such people want to die, but death does not come. They search for death more than for hidden treasure. They would be happy to find their grave. They would rejoice to find their tomb. But God keeps their future a secret and builds a wall around them, around them to protect them. When it is time to eat, all I can do is sigh with sadness, not joy. My groans pour out like water. I was afraid something terrible would happen, and what I feared most has happened. I cannot calm down or relax. I am too upset to rest." Some hard things to hear. So, what would be the proper response if you heard someone say that? If you were Job's friend in that moment, you know everything he's lost, you've been sitting with him and he hasn't said a thing for 7 days and you really haven't talked about it, and then he comes out and says this, how should you respond? How would you respond? It would be really hard to hear him say, in this, he brings God into it, and to hear him talk about, I wish God would just have killed me. And he talks about how I wish I would have been buried as a child. These are hard things to hear. And Job, being the godly person he is, probably wouldn't say these things on an average day. But people going through grieving are not being rational, right? They're just, kind of like what Shirley said, this is his heart speaking, right? He's saying, I wish I had never lived. Is Job suicidal here? I don't think he's suicidal, but he's overwhelmed, he's crushed, he's exhausted, he's grieving so deeply that he questions the value of his own existence. He wished what had happened hadn't happened, even if that meant he lost all the joys in his life. And maybe, and I wouldn't be surprised if at the end of all of this, at the end of the book of Job, he would say, what I said, I wouldn't take it all back. I don't wish I had actually died when I was born. But in this moment, he's just expressing feelings, right? Not rationality. Yeah, Shirley?
I don't know if I would respond verbally.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a great response.
I probably would give him a hug.
Perfect.
I would just give him a hug and let him know, I hear what you said, I feel what, know how you feel, don't know how you feel, and see, if you say it verbally, you say that. And
Yeah.
you don't.
Yeah.
You're not in their shoes.
Right.
So I think sometimes just being quiet.
Yeah.
And give him a hug.
I love that. I love that, yeah. I wouldn't respond. I would just give him a hug. And in this moment, these words, it sounds like Job needs a hug. That's what it sounds like. I don't think there are any words that can fully soothe him at this moment, right? Right, Aaron?
I think similarly, don't leave them.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Sometimes people can be very angry, and that is uncomfortable, but don't leave them.
Don't leave them.
Because that can kind of almost validate some of what they're feeling. This is so terrible. It's so terrible that the people around you are leaving. Stay with them.
Mm-hmm.
Push through that discomfort.
Mm-hmm.
Because eventually, hopefully, they will come out of that
Mm-hmm.
thinking, and they will still have someone there who can help them then process what they said.
Right.
Then there may even be a level about having said that.
Yeah, yep. Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, in this moment, they're feeling extremely lonely, and you not being there affirms their loneliness, 100%. Yeah.
I agree to the point that when I lost that, I was very angry at one point because I had to go home and tell my kids.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't know what to say. Mom would try her best, Brenda would try her best, but I was like, when I got to that angry part, I didn't want to be around anybody.
Yep.
There's a side to me that you guys never see, and it's not very pretty.
Mm.
And yeah, I went down there, I drove down there, and I yelled at them.
Yeah.
Are you leaving? You know, I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
you don't know.
Right.
But at that point, there are sometimes people don't want to be around, and it's not because they're suicidal or you're
Right.
afraid they're going to do something. It's just that sharp tongue.
Yep. You're right. I mean, yeah, they don't hold back in that moment. So one of the things you need to do is you need to let them express themselves. Don't be afraid. It may make you uncomfortable, but I promise you, they feel 1,000 times more uncomfortable than you. Don't be afraid to let them talk about the person that they just lost. Don't be afraid to reminisce with them. Sometimes it's good to look at old photographs, treasured possessions. That can be therapeutic. These are not the moments to correct their statements about God or life, right? Like Job said, I wish I'd never been born. Why didn't I die as a baby? Your response should not be, well, don't say that. You shouldn't feel that way. That's not biblical. That's what Job's friends did, and they said worse things than that. So don't do that. But also, the phrases we typically say also are not good expressions. God needed another angel. Like, that won't help you in the middle of pain. They can come to that conclusion, but you don't say that. This was God's plan. It may have been, but they don't want to hear that in that moment. That's going to hurt them worse. Let them come to that conclusion. Everything happens for a reason. That's true, but that's not what they need to hear. God won't give you more than you can handle. I hate it when we say that to people who are hurting. I was reading a book by a Jewish rabbi who was talking to a woman who lost her young son. Some people kept telling her, God won't give you more than you can handle. And her response was, if that's the case, I wish I was weaker. Maybe my son would still be alive. That's tough stuff. She blamed herself. And so, and we said this several times, it's just better not to say anything. Really? Clint?
Yeah, I think,
Patty, did you have something?
Yeah, when I lost my husband Wayne, I went to a very dark place during my grief stage where I started to struggle with it.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah. It's very hard. And,
there was times I struggled.
oh yeah.
Precious tongue and left it out.
Mm-hmm. That's wonderful.
It's amazing.
We need to avoid saying things like, at least, whatever you might say. Well, at least he lived a long life. At least you can have more kids. At least she's in a better place. At least you're young. Don't say those things. They kind of minimize the grief and feel dismissive. Instead, you can say things like, I'm so sorry, I'm here for you, this is hard, and I'm here with you, right? Don't try to make sense of the loss. Do not try to bring reason to it. That's something that they need to do, right? They need compassion, not explanations, right? And don't say, this happened because. No, God must be teaching you something. Just be there with them and say, we'll face this together. If you are going to bring God into it, just echo what Scripture has to say and be careful. Things like God is near the brokenhearted. Remember, Jesus wept with the grieving. God will make things right in heaven. Remind them of heaven, but at the same time, you have to keep it very ambiguous and vague and let them apply it to their own situation, right? Because that's part of the healing of the grieving situation is them making sense of it so they can apply these things. Don't think poorly of people for doubting God. Some of the godliest characters in the Bible who had strong faith doubted God. Job, David, Jeremiah. Biblical characters questioned God while grieving. So this is not a moment to offer lectures. We have to validate the emotions without validating their conclusion. If they're saying, God did this to me, I'm so mad at him, validate the feelings and saying, You don't want to say, I know what you're going through, even though mentally you understand the idea of what they're feeling, but not what they're feeling, right? You can say, I'm so sorry that you're going through this right now. That now is not the time to address this. So here's the thing. I'm halfway through this. I have some more. So 2 options. 1, I can just offer to email this to anyone who wants it, or 2, we can spend 1 more class on it. Does anyone want to do that second one?
Sounds good to me.
Second one? Okay. We'll spend 1 more week on this and kind of touch on it a little bit more. That sounds good. Okay. I will see you guys in 15 minutes.